Howdy, this lecture is for the course INST 222, Foundations of Education in a Multicultural Society. The objective is for students to understand the history and approaches to multicultural education, and we'll do that via this lecture and discussion forums with 100% participation. On your screen, you'll note that there are several key terms and concepts that you'll need to refer to for this presentation. Those of us who have any understanding of the great historical legacy of our country understand that there are four key events in our nation's history that we all sit up and take notice to, including the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, and the Civil Rights Movement. But the last critical incident in America's history gets very little attention in our K through 12 textbooks or in the American discussion. And all four events have transformed the way that we interact in our great democracy. But the Civil Rights Movement has garnered little attention and conversation in the American school system. A lot of future Aggie teachers, for example, don't realize that it was the Civil Rights Movement that helped to empower persons with disabilities and women, a lot of different cultural groups and ethnic groups, and we need to be aware of that. It was also this movement that gave rise to multicultural education. We're going to begin the chapter by skipping ahead, if you will, to page 23, and we need to recognize this particular quote by Elwood Cubberley. Cubberley is important because he is one of the great educational activists of the turn of the century, and he helped to orchestrate a lot of what happens in the American school system. So when we look at leaders of that time, late 1800s, early 20th century, Elwood Cubberley ranks among the top figures. And many of them thought the same way that Cubberley did. And the reason we have to look to his ideology and his thinking, because it was this kind of thinking that influenced the way American schools worked during that time. So he can be credited as being one of the architects or framers of the 20th century educational system. Cubberley is quoted as saying, "Everywhere these people," talking about immigrants, "tend to settle in groups or settlements, and to set up here their national manners, customs, and observances. Our task is to break up these groups or settlements and to assimilate and amalgamate these people as part of our American race, and to implant in their children, as far as can be done, the Anglo-Saxon conception of righteousness, law and order, and popular government, and to awaken in them a reverence for our democratic institutions and for those things in our national life which we as a people hold to be of abiding worth." And many of our leaders, whether we're talking about the government or the educational system, came from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds. They came from parts of the United Kingdom and parts of Europe that were considered respectable or admired, and folks who had a lot of influence that time, who had English backgrounds, can trace their roots back to Germanic roots, which were very much Anglo-Saxon indeed, and they brought their ideas and their way of seeing the world and had it infiltrate in nearly every institution in our country, whether we're talking about medicine or law, and in this case education. And that's not such a bad thing. The Anglo-Saxon way of doing things and the values about democracy are quite admirable. But it becomes really dangerous when you want to stamp out other cultural groups and their way of doing things, and you want them to adopt and take on your way, to totally assimilate and let go of who they are. As we get into our chapter, part one of our reading, Banks tells us that nativism is quite simply anti-immigration sentiment. And it was during much of our early part of our country into the 1700s that people from certain parts of the United Kingdom and Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland gained a real strong foothold in our country, and they implanted into our systems their ways of doing things. And so they were considered the old immigrants, and they took great stock in great reverence in that fact. And then we had what were called the new immigrants who started to come over, and these were people who were considered the undesirables. These were people who were Italian and Irish and Greek and Polish, and their ways of doing things were really frowned upon, and these people were not welcome. They weren't welcome into the political system. They weren't welcome into the economic system. The new education system wanted to melt people down into this one way of being, hence the phrase the melting pot. So that if you come from Chinese or Irish, Italian, Russian, or Mexican background, the goal was for you to melt away or shed exactly who you are so that you can become this desirable Anglo-Saxon sort of culture and adopt those ways. There were two major goals, according to page 22 of our reading, of the Anglo-Saxon push, and that was to rid ethnic groups of their ethnic characteristics and to force them to acquire Anglo-Saxon values and behavior. And that's what Cubberley was talking about in his quote. So education, the field of education and schools worked really hard to get people to let go of their cultural ways, their food, their language, and to melt into this new way of doing things. And so that may be good if you are of Anglo-Saxon background and you can easily adopt this new Americanized version of what it means to be Anglo-Saxon. But if you come from Poland or China or Russia or Mexico, of course one would find it a bit harder to sort of melt and assimilate in this kind of way. We have to ask ourselves, is this a good idea? A lot of folks very early on were pushing back, and an opposite ideology of assimilation was growing, and this ideology is called pluralism. And pluralism is this idea that we all can hold on to our unique ethnic and cultural identities and yet at the same time be a part of this great beautiful experiment in America, right? This new idea of what it means to be an American. But there were two immigration acts that were pushing back against this new call of pluralism that really laughed in the face of this new call for this new diversity before the word was even coined. So in 1917, there were new immigration acts that, would challenge folks coming from, let's say, Greece or Poland to be able to pass certain reading tests, and there were other barriers set in place to prevent people from coming over and becoming naturalized citizens. And then in 1924, the U.S. instituted quota systems so that we would only allow a certain number of people from these countries that we considered undesirable from coming into our country. As we move on between the two world wars, we're talking about maybe the somewhere around 1918 to the early part of the 1940s, there was something else going on too. There was still this call for people to be who they are, this call for pluralism. If you look on the screen to your right, that we were pushing this idea of not sort of melting into one another, but that we would hold on and retain our true character, much like a salad. You see in the picture to your right that there's a salad bowl as opposed to a melting pot. And this philosophy was saying I can still be American and adopt all these great values, but at the same time hold on to my unique Mexican identity or Russian identity or Polish identity. It really was something new and progressive in the face of this assimilationist call. We had a lot going on during this time between the two world wars. For example, the Merriam Report was one of the first academic reports that connected culture and education. And this report said that, Native American learners can learn best when we use their unique cultural identity to leverage learning experiences inside the classroom. And this study followed several students and learners and classes over a period of time, and so that academic achievement can happen when you recognize culture for learners. So we've known about this idea of using culture to inspire academic gains, and yet a lot of these reports sat unanswered. There were many scholars in the 30s and 40s who were anthropologists and sociologists who were also saying the same thing. They were saying that it's okay for people to embrace who they are. We all need to have a sense of identity. It helps with your sense of self and your self-esteem and your self-worth. And when people feel good about themselves, then they are therefore able to commit more academically. When we look at the two ideologies side by side, we see the difference. A lot of us feel good saying that phrase, melting pot, but it really isn't a good phrase. What we're actually saying is, I need to shed my uniqueness, my cultural identity, what it means to be French American, what it means to be Mexican American, or what it means to be Polish American, and just melt down into this one ideal to assimilate. And what pluralism is saying, yes, being a part of this cohesive group known as Americans is a really wonderful idea. And yet we also can at the same time hold on to our uniqueness. So people were pushing this pluralism ideology in the face of assimilation and going with a new metaphor, not the melting pot, but the salad bowl. And in this case, I still get to be who I am while at the same time respecting the wonderful values and culture of America. As we move on to the third part of the reading, the intergroup education movement, this was a significant movement of the 1940s and 50s when the early ideas about multicultural education began, even before the phrase was uttered, and this was before the civil rights movement. For example, we had a lot of our soldiers returning from World War II who were Latino and American, who were African American, who were Asian American, and these soldiers were not given the same basic benefits as their white counterparts. They couldn't get access to the GI Bill. They could not get certain jobs. They could not move into certain neighborhoods. Their children still could not go to school with white children, and so they were saying, we are putting our lives on the line for this country that we love and adore, and yet we can't embrace the same benefits as our white peers. They were quite outraged. This caused a lot of tensions to boil up in the post-World War II eras. And so the intergroup education movement emerged as a response to this tension. So education was saying, maybe we should do something on the K through 12 level and on the college level so that we can teach people about each other and we start to learn how to live in harmony. So one of those projects was called the Intergroup Education Cooperating Schools Project. That was an elementary and secondary level project which was national in scope that attempted to raise awareness about these issues. The other project was the College Study and Intergroup Relations. That also was a national project, but that was done on a college level to teach these same kinds of objectives. Well, the intergroup education movement didn't make the gains that it had aspired to do. As we move on to part 4 of the reading, the authors they focus on assimilation, the new pluralism, and the new immigrants. We find that even into the 60s, this idea of assimilation was still being pushed. And we also find that there is this new pluralism that is coming out of it all as well. This idea that those who are saying, we want fair housing, we want to be able to get better jobs, and we want our kids to go to better schools and have greater resources at these schools. And it was during this time that we start to see the emergence of ethnic courses. This is where one could go and take a course on what it means to be a Jewish American, for example, or an or a women's course, a gender issues course. And it was during this time as well that the civil rights movement really gained in its fervor. If you take a look at your screen on the right, we look at the timeline of the height of the civil rights movement. And those of us who are paying attention to our nation's history understand that the civil rights movement happened long before the 1950s, and it is still going on today. But what this timeline represents is the height of the movement. And we know that it was during this time that most of the legislative gains happened. For example, in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. We know that the 1964 Civil Rights Amendment happened in the early part of the 60s. We also had the 1965 Voting Rights Amendment as a result of those three marches in Selma. And so we need to be aware of what was going on in history. And these kinds of events during the height have given way to a lot of civil liberties that a lot of us enjoy today. We cannot forget that slavery ended in the late 1860s, but we had a secondary version of slavery in this country whereby we had recognized and sanctioned segregation for 100 years. And so we've only had a few decades where we haven't had these tensions that were experienced in the middle part of the 20th century, where we hadn't had these laws that separated different ethnic groups. And so we are still dealing with the aftermath of 250 years of slavery and then 100 years of segregation, and we've only had a few decades in your lifetime, your parents' lifetime, whereby we haven't had these laws hanging over us. So you can imagine that there will be still today some leftover residual aftermath, if you will, from this legacy of slavery and segregation in our country. So we have to look at now who the new immigrants are. So since the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, it sort of counteracted those prior immigration acts. And this is when we started to allow immigrants from various countries into our beautiful country. We had folks from Latin countries as well as Asian countries. They were now the new immigrants. And we are seeing and experiencing an increase in non-white immigrants and a decrease in the birth rate among our white citizens in this country. So that means that overall we're seeing a decline in our white citizens in this country and an increase in the diversity. By the year 2050, the U.S. is projected to be about 51% persons of color and about 49% white. By the year 2030, we're expecting that most of our classrooms throughout the United States will be made up of children of color. However, in our classrooms, we still have the majority of our teacher population that is primarily white, female, middle-class, Christian, monolingual. And right now, today in the state of Texas, most of our kids are kids of color. Only 30% of the kids in Texas classrooms are white. So what does that mean? Well, that means that our teachers, for sure, they don't have to be of color to teach kids of color. That's a misnomer. But they do need to be culturally competent and able to connect with the kids on a very personal and relationship level. And they need to have the attitudes, the knowledge, and the skills to do so. Because we are dealing with an achievement gap in this country. And when we talk about achievement gaps, we're talking about the gap in the way that we discipline our kids in the classroom. There's a gap in the dropout rate, and there's a gap in the overall academic levels. If you take, for example, how our kids are doing, our white children, our black children, our Latino children are doing in this country, and you look at their math scores and their reading scores, on the right, you'll see with the bar graphs represent the shaded areas represent our kids of color, and the red line represents how our white children are doing in these subject areas. And you see in math and in reading at different age levels that the kids of color are underperforming their white counterparts. There's a reason for that. And a teacher who's not thinking very clearly might say, well, kids of color are just not as smart. But the other reason might be that we haven't taught our teachers how to identify and connect with the culture of these kids and make learning relevant to their lives. That might be the other hypothesis. And that is pretty much the thinking of those of us who are multiculturalists. We feel that our teachers need to be more culturally sensitive and better able to interact and teach in a way that really turns on learning inside the classroom. As we move on to part 5 of the reading, we start to hear about the emergence of multicultural education. And when we think about what's going on around the world, we know that nations who are experiencing an increase in diversity, they are also dealing with these challenges inside the classroom as well. So this idea that we're dealing with some challenges in diversity is strictly a U.S. Um, problem. That's not the case. We know that all around the world, countries are experiencing the same types of challenges because people haven't figured out how to look at diversity as an opportunity. We still look at diversity as an obstacle. As we move on in the reading, our authors explain to us the 5 phases of multicultural education. Multicultural education hasn't always been as we know it. There were phases before it, and if we look closely, we'll still see these phases in existence today, the authors say. The authors tell us that multicultural education started out with phase 1, and that it was characterized by monoethnic courses. And this assumption was that only a member of an ethnic group should teach a course on that group, and a focus on that particular group, and the oppression of people of color. And we know that that's not the case. We know that anybody should be able to teach a mono-ethnic course. Mono means one. And so when you take that type of course, that means you are focusing on one particular ethnic group, maybe our Jewish brothers and sisters, or Latino brothers and sisters, or French brothers and sisters, whatever the ethnic group might be, but the focus is on one ethnic group. And so the thinking before used to be only someone from that background can teach that type of course. And that is absolutely not the case. As long as you are well versed on the topic, we know that anyone can teach a monoethnic course. In phase 2 are multi-ethnic studies, and the multi-ethnic studies phase of the development of multicultural education, this comprises courses, and these courses become more global, conceptual, and scholarly during this period. And so, as the name suggests, multi means many, and so the focus is on not just one ethnic group, but many ethnic groups. And so we start to see courses that become a little bit more rigorous. These courses usually use a comparative approach where they compare the history and legacy of one ethnic group to another, and so we should keep that in mind. In phase 3, we have the multi-ethnic education, and our authors tell us that as ethnic studies became more global and widespread, more and more educators began to recognize that they began to recognize uh, that even though reforming the course of study in schools and colleges was necessary, it was not sufficient to result in the effective educational reform. So the negative attitudes of many teachers made their use of new ethnic materials and teaching strategies ineffective and in some cases harmful. And so here we start to see the emergence of the dualistic approach to multicultural education, where we're not just talking about, okay, what to teach, but who should teach it and how to teach it. Here the focus is on the multicultural educators as well. There is a focus on teachers and their attitudes and some of the biases that they may bring to the classroom. And so this phase not only just looked at the learners and the subject matter, but also on the pedagogical approaches to teaching, and taking a look at teachers themselves and their attitudes and biases that they might bring to the classroom. Now in phase 4, that's multicultural education. You'll notice we go from ethnic to culture. Multi, many cultures. So this is the study of many cultures. So you'll find in multicultural education the focus is not just on one ethnic group or several ethnic groups, but we move beyond ethnicity and focus on many different cultures, like gender issues, or persons with disabilities, or issues dealing with persons from who speak several different languages. So the focus now moves away from this a discussion on ethnicity, but on the various different types of diversity that one might encounter. Now, phase 5 is a place we have not gotten to yet. It's called institutionalization. And this is the place where we aspire to be in multicultural education. This is a place where we have total school reform in every subject area on every grade level, if you can imagine that. And so every part of the school system, whether we're talking about policies or sports or counseling or academics, whatever it is, all of it has been affected by the philosophy of pluralism. And so it's a place that the field of multicultural education aspires to be. It is systemic in nature, meaning that it is experienced throughout the total school environment. And we're not there yet, but it's a place of aspiration for sure. As we move on, we look more closely at the phase where we are now. This is phase 4, and it's the study of all cultural groups, as I said before. So we're looking at issues of SES, or social economic status, sexuality, language, ethnicity, exceptionality, gender, citizenship, religion. We could have so many raindrops under that umbrella. We could fill up the screen. And then if we're using the umbrella as a metaphor for multicultural education, then the clouds above the umbrella would represent, the 3 parts of multicultural education. And that would be that multicultural education is a process, it is a reform movement, and it is an ideology. So when we take a look at a real good definition for multicultural education, Banks on page 5 tells us that multicultural education describes a wide variety of programs and practices related to educational equity for women, ethnic groups, language minorities, low-income groups, and people with disabilities. So again, multicultural education describes a wide variety of programs and practices related to educational equity or pluralism. As we move on to part 6 of our reading, the authors Banks and Banks talk to us about the rationale and the goals of multicultural education. He says the reason that we always talk about these issues of diversity and really get into some hard-hitting topics on ethnicity and race and all that is because these are salient issues and salient themes that come up again and again in American conversations. And so we need to have these conversations that are educational in nature. He goes on to tell us that many of us as Americans lead very culturally and ethnically encapsulated lives. And what that means is that if you look very closely at the places where we grew up or places of worship, who comes to our home, who are our friends, they look a whole lot like us. A lot of us don't have a lot of diversity in our lives. That means we have been enclosed, we have been encapsulated and segregated from the rest of the diversity in our country. Banks and Banks remind us that the goals of multicultural education is to, understand different perspectives of people, to learn about other people's culture, to have these conversations so we decrease discrimination. And if we do this all correctly, we can increase achievement because we can learn about the culture of others, appreciate it, value it, and then insert it into our curricula. Banks goes on to tell us that, one of the essential goals of multicultural education is total school reform. And this is when we work very hard to modify the total school environment, that we get to things that we don't know are hidden and that are affecting students in a negative way, whether it's policies that don't support our kids or our learners who are going through difficult times, or it's policies and programs that are going on inside the school that don't include or not inclusive of all of our learners. So multicultural education is calling for systemic reform, that we address every part of the total school environment so that kids feel a part of the community. Banks tell us we need to do this because we need to be culturally competent citizens and teachers. And for me, the definition of cultural competency is the ability to seamlessly communicate and interact with cultural groups different from yourself. Isn't that great? Just think about it. Whether you're interacting with someone who's extremely gifted, or they have maybe some physical challenges, or they speak another language, or they're from some other ethnic group that's unfamiliar to you. It doesn't matter who they are. That a culturally competent person can seamlessly interact and communicate with all different cultural groups. So, are you that kind of person? Are you culturally competent? Well, Banks tell us that everyone is not. We have different levels of functioning from level 1 all the way up to level 4. And that the goal really has to be that we find a way to get to level 3 ideally. For example, at level 1, you're the type of person who may be fascinated with, other cultural groups. You may go eat at a restaurant, for example, but you are not someone who feels comfortable around a different cultural group. By the time you get to level 2, you are able to communicate a little bit. Maybe you can speak the language. Maybe you understand some of the values and attitudes of that cultural group. But you still have a distinct circle that is absolutely different from that other cultural group. And there still is that barrier that exists. By the time you get to level 3, this is the ideal position in my opinion. This is a person who is thoroughly bicultural, and they're highly assimilated. They can go back and forth from their own culture to another cultural group, and they can weave seamlessly from their own to the other cultural group. By the time you get to level 4, I think this level might be a little dangerous, because here you are completely assimilated, and this is a place where folks have totally let go of their own original or primordial culture and have totally adopted another culture. And in that case, assimilation is very high. And I don't know if this is a place where we want to be. Those who believe in the melting pot theory might think that that is a good place to be at level 4. But those of us who believe in pluralism believe that maybe level 3 is the better place, because you can go over and become integrated and assimilated with a cultural group, but you can always go back to your own, and you still hold on to that group as well. As we move on to part 7 of the reading, Banks tells us something that's really important for future teachers to understand, that there are 4 ways to approach multicultural education, and not all of them are the same, and we have to look at them differently. And there's the contributions approach, the additive, transformation, and the social action approach. So if we look at each one separately, we know at a very basic level, at level 1, the contributions approach, this is where educators treat multicultural education as kind of a heroes and holidays approach. They may have some rice and beans for Latino Heritage Month, and you come into their room and you might see a bulletin board for Women's History Month of famous, female inventors. But they only do it to sort of celebrate on a very superficial level. It doesn't somehow, this information about these other cultural groups does not infiltrate their curriculum in a meaningful way at all. They love the celebration of it all, but it doesn't come into the curriculum. By the time you get to the level 2 approach, the additive approach, this is where a teacher attempts to be a little bit more multicultural, and they may select a few lessons. They may overhaul an entire week or month by including another cultural group in the contributions into their science, language arts, or history curriculum. But it only lasts for a little while, a day, a week, a month. They've inserted a little bit about other or various cultural groups, but it doesn't have a meaningful impact in a sustained way. Now, level 3 is where we want future K through 12 teachers and even educators in higher ed. This is where we wish them to go. This is where the curriculum is totally transformed. From the first day of school to the last day of school, for example, in a language arts course, one might be treated with the readings of Native American poets. You may find out about Russian laureates. You may even hear about maybe some of the great writing of African American women. because at that level, you're saying not only do we have great white male writers, but we have great writers from every different ethnic group from around this great country, and we can include their work into the curriculum as well. And so that becomes transformational. And you're not getting it in a week, in a month, but these ideas and the contributions of others is sustained throughout the school year. In the social action approach, it's transformation plus. So that means you're totally transforming the curriculum plus you're going to the learners themselves to hear their voices, and so they can be involved in the decision making process of your curriculum. A great example of that is the Freedom Writers movie, where the students were engaged in their language arts course, and the students then became involved in fundraising so that they could get a Holocaust survivor to their school to have conversations about her writing and take it a little bit further. They became involved. They became socially active. They made decisions. So we know that the teacher in that movie transformed the curriculum, but she did something else. She allowed the students' voices to matter as well. And so that case is a great example of the social action approach. Now, the authors say it's okay to mix the approaches. It is sometimes okay to have a celebration or to insert something here or there. We may have to do that. So we shouldn't abandon the level 1 and level 2. But the real goal for future educators is to get to that level 3, where your learners are constantly being treated by the great work of everyone who's contributed to our great country. It makes the curriculum that much richer and rigorous. And that's part 1 of our MA reading number 1. Thank you, and gig 'em.